This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Allie, Thaddeus G., V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, and Gold_81. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and for this episode, I'm going to take a little bit of a turn back into Japanese folklore. And our topic for today is going to be a creature, a yokai, called Nure-onna. Now, Nure-onna, I'm going to read several different descriptions of her from at least 3 or 4 different sources. It's interesting, there's not a whole lot in the academic sources that I had reviewed, at least the ones that I have access to, other than her inclusion in certain Japanese bestiaries of these kinds of fantastical types of creatures. Now, Nure-onna, as I mentioned, is a yokai, which is a kind of spirit. Yokai are spirits that inhabit things. In some versions, they could even be potentially ancestral spirits that might become yokai. I mean, the closest parallel, and I'm not going to swear that this is an exact parallel, would be the kinds of nature spirits or fairies, or just these kinds of beings of nature that we have when we think of a more animistic way of looking at the world, where everything is kind of imbued with spirit. The Nure-onna seems to belong to, the yokai generally seem to belong to this class. And some are beneficent and some are not. And Nure-onna definitely belongs to the category of those that are not, although in some versions she is somewhat neutral. So what I want to do with today's podcast is I'm going to talk about her. I'm going to read different descriptions of her from different places. And then we're going to look at the elements of her story, as we usually do in this podcast. And we're going to kind of take things apart and see what we can make of this particular folkloric character. So where I'm going to start, I'm going to jump right into the discussion of Nure-onna in Wikipedia. And then I'm going to move to several other blogs that are kind of encyclopedic works, really, of Japanese folklore, or of yokai in particular. Okay, so here's the Wikipedia definition. It says Nure-onna it literally means wet woman. Okay, that's what the name translates to. It says it's a Japanese yokai which represents a reptilian creature with the head of a woman and the body of a snake. They are also seen as a paranormal phenomena at sea under the name of Nore-onna. In legends, they are often said to consume humans, but they have no single appearance or personality. Okay, so the fact that they have no single appearance or personality tells you that they have more of the characteristic of a nature spirit or a natural force, because it's something that isn't necessarily going to have, it's not going to necessarily have a strong identity or backstory or something like that, in the way that you might see with a ghost, or like when we look at the hungry ghosts from a lot of Japanese literature, and also even within China as well, where we have this idea. So you're not talking about, say, a woman who has died a violent death or something like that. I mean, there's certain characteristics of Nure-onna that represent those women, especially a particular class of ghost, which is known as, let me just get the name right, ubume, I think is the correct way to say this, the name. And I'll correct myself later if I find a correction, but I'm pretty sure that's what the name is, the ubume, which is a woman weeping, carrying a child, and the common element there is that they always look for a passerby to carry the child, particularly usually a man, to hold the baby for her. Okay, but we're going to get into that story in a minute. So they're talking about the concept of Nure-onna here. It says they are similar to the yokai called Chthonia of Kyushu. Now, Chthonia are vampiric creatures. And like the Chthonia, they are said to appear at seas or rivers. Their name comes from how their hair is always wet in legends. They are also theorized to be the changed form of sea snakes. Okay, so let me look at some other definitions here. I just want to go through a variety of them to try to get the full picture. Now, this is from Yokai.com, which is an online database of Japanese folklore. And this description of Nure-onna says, translation, wet woman, alternate names, Nuri-omejo, okay, we just said. The habitat, coasts, rivers, other bodies of water, native to Kyushu, and the diet is blood, okay, which is extremely Chtonic. Okay, so in appearance, it says Nure-onna are vampiric sea serpents who haunt shores and rivers looking for humans to eat. They are most commonly found on the shores of the island of Kyushu, but there are stories of Nure-onna encounters as far north as Niigata Prefecture and as far east as Fukushima Prefecture. There are two variations of this yokai, one without arms, which resembles an enormous sea serpent with a woman's head, and one with human-like arms. Aside from this difference, the two look and act exactly in the same manner. Their faces are hideous and betray serpent-like features such as a forked tongue. They have long black hair which sticks to their dripping bodies. The name comes from the fact that they always appear soaking wet. Now, they're talking about the interactions with the Nure-onna here as well. While physically much stronger than a human, Nure-onna prefer not to rely on brute force and use trickery and guile to catch their prey. Now, this is interesting because at the Institute for Study of Feminine Myth, we had a class last night about female tricksters. And the fact that certainly in European lore, there don't seem to be any female tricksters. But it was pointed out by somebody in the class that the Japanese yokai do actually have many examples of this. And Nure-onna is in fact one of them. So she is a trickster of a sort, but she does this in order to catch and feed on the unsuspecting and unfortunate traveler who happens to pass her by. So they most often appear near the water on a coast or by a riverbank. Nure-onna magically disguise themselves as a distressed woman carrying a bundled up baby. They cry out for help from fishers, sailors, or anybody passing by. When the prey approaches, a Nure-onna will plead with their victim to hold her baby for just a moment so that she can rest. If he agrees and takes the bundle, the quote-unquote baby becomes as heavy as a boulder. The victim is unable to move. The Nure-onna is then free to attack her helpless victim, feeding by draining his blood with her long serpentine tongue. And it says Nure-onna frequently appear together and cooperate with Ushi-oni as they inhabit the same environments and share the same diet. Now, Ushi-oni are what they call ox demons. Okay, and this is another type of creature that is often seen close to the water. And in fact, I read at least in one place that sometimes they feel that Nure-onna are possessed by Ushi-oni. So interesting idea there. So here we see the story of her as being a trickster who tricks people into thinking that she is a woman who is in need of help, and that she is exhausted and needs someone to hold her baby for her. And this is actually, and so preying on the kindness of people, and then they unfortunately become immobilized, and then she attacks them. So, and here's another one from Yokai Mythology, WordPress.com. The Nure-onna, again, wet woman. Nure-onna are yokai that resemble serpents, typically with the head of a woman and the body of a snake. On occasion, they also have arms. They tend to lurk through aquatic environments and pretend to be women in distress in order to lure humans to devour. Okay, so this is the same idea. And finally, there's one as a blog called, it's a website, yokaimania.com. Okay, and their description of the Nure-onna shows as the body of a snake and a head of a woman. There are 3 different stories about this creature. One story suggests she simply wants to be left alone and can be seen sometimes looking reflective while washing her hair. Washing hair is another interesting imagery that's been talked about with mermaids and certain other creatures. I know certainly I attended a talk on water, the water in these kinds of as a liminal space. It was a conference I had attended, and somebody had talked about the images of mermaids always combing their hair, and what that might mean, because we often think about that as a kind of sign of vanity in some way, but there's something about the seductiveness of the hair. And of course, those were images that were appearing on churches. And it's interesting too, because Nure-onna actually sounds a little bit like a mermaid, except that it's said that the top half of her body is actually hideous and she has this forked tongue. But she's half woman and half sea serpent or half fish. So in a way, she does seem to be a kind of malevolent mermaid in a way. Not exactly, but there's that idea, what we see here. Okay. Another story, she eats humans whole, and yet in another story, she carries with her a bundle, sometimes referred to as a baby. And if you ask to hold the bundle, or if you are asked to hold the bundle will attach itself to you so you can't remove it. Okay, so in one, they say that the bundle is very, very heavy, and then you have to, in other words, it's so heavy, but then you can't drop it. Or if you're thinking it is a baby, you're afraid that this... That if you drop this baby, that you're going to hurt it. So that there's kind of two implications here. It says, or if you ask to hold it, will attach itself to you so you can't remove it. It can turn into a rock to weigh you down and then transform into a Nure-onna and eat you. Okay, so that in that version, it's not so much that the woman is giving you something to weight you down so you can't move. It's more the idea that the bundle actually turns into Nure-onna, at least in this particular version of what's being said. So, okay. So this is very interesting. Now, if we think about yokai, again, they're the kinds of spirits that populate the universe that we live in, the world that we live in. And I was reading an academic piece on the yokai. It was on basically a description of this Japanese bestiary. And one of the things that was said about these creatures is that they were talking about how the history of them through the different periods, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The Wikipedia article goes over it to some degree, but you have this idea that these spirits, that these yokai, are that people in Japan, they said that they're more readily understood or experienced by people who are living close to nature or who are in nature. So I think there was a period of time when people had to leave their homes, during like wartime and go out into the wilderness, that being out in those kinds of spaces brought them closer to the idea of the yokai. And you can understand this if we think about fairy lore that we see, say, throughout Europe or even in America. You have this idea that we always see stories about the woods and about what may roam in the woods. Now, one of the interesting things about Nure-onna in her form that is called the Nure-mejo is that she does have this quality connected to the fairies of leading people astray or leading people away from where they're trying to get to. And now here's a piece that they said they were talking about the Edo period. In this is Edo's being an earlier name for Tokyo. They depict this yokai as a woman with a snake body and would make it appear that this was a well-known yokai of the time, but there are no stories about a snake-bodied Nure-onna in classical literature of that time that can be found. Despite this, according to the essay Yokai Gadan Zenshu Jo, the early Showa period folklorist Morihiko Fujisawa, despite not pointing out any primary sources as references, states that there is the following story from the year Bonkyu 2, which is 1819 of the Edo period. And here's the story. I'll read it to you. At a certain riverside on the border between the Echigo province, now the Niigata prefecture, and Aizu, now the Fukushima prefecture, as some young lads were heading out on several boats to collect wood, one boat was swept far away. The people on the swept away boat found one woman washing her hair, and they thought it was mysterious at first, but eventually they raised a scream and desperately started rowing their boat. They finally reunited with the other boats they were originally with, and when one of those others asked, "Did you see a big snake or something?" the ones who were swept away answered, "Something even more terrifying. It was a wet woman, a Nure-onna." The others did not believe them and ignored the attempts by the ones who were originally swept away to stop them and headed towards where that woman was. The ones who were previously swept away turned back out of fear, but the others who went to the Nure-onna heard a terrifying scream beneath them several times. It is said that the Nure-onna has a tail that is at least 3 cho, which is about 327 meters long. That's like about 1,000 feet. So once one is found, there is no escape, and it is said that those others never returned. So in this case, we're not talking about her with the baby or the vampirism necessarily, but she is a woman who's kind of out in the water washing her hair, and supposedly she's got this tail that's like 1,000 feet long. And yeah, and so when the boats go to her, she has this scream. So you hear this terrifying scream. Now that's an interesting feature, because you will hear about this frequently if we follow the lore of these. Some people think of them as cryptids, or some people think of them as these forest spirits. Even on videos that we see now, you'll see things like this on TikTok with different folkloric things. I see a lot of these from Appalachia, again, which is no relation to the Japanese folklore, but you do have this idea of being in the woods and suddenly hearing a woman screaming. And really, when you see this in different folkloric motifs, the idea is that it's a lure. There's this motif of the woman who is in trouble, or the woman who needs help, who is actually just trying to lure somebody to her. And this is kind of the implication. So yeah, they see a woman brushing her hair, or washing her hair, and they're thinking, well, that's odd to see her out in this part of the river. But then realizing she had the body of a serpent and going, oh, that's we want to get away from that. But the others don't believe it. So they go out to her. They don't heed the warning, and then they disappear. And the presumption there is almost that because of the long tail, or the long coils of the tail, it's almost like she's able to capture their boat in some way, because she has because that has the power she has. Although it was noted in the other, she doesn't tend to use brute force but trickery. So yeah, so this is definitely part of a folkloric idea about a ruse that is made by either, like I said, either by a woman screaming. Sometimes you might even hear a child in some of these types of tales. And again, it's something where normally you as a human being, as an empathetic human being, would say, oh, somebody's in trouble, I need to go help them. And it takes advantage of that. So it creates this fundamental kind of distrust that we see here. But ultimately it's basically almost like a cautionary tale, like when you hear this, not to go out and help, because it can cost you your life. You could be cannibalized or, vampirically drained of your blood by one of these creatures. And so the elements of these stories do raise an interesting dynamic. Let's just see. I'm going to look a little bit more into the folklore here. In the Iwami region of the Shimane prefecture, the Nure-onna is a mysterious water being used by an Chthonia, which, as I mentioned, is an ox demon, and would appear by the sea and hand over a baby it is hugging to someone, then return to the sea, whereupon an Chthonia would appear. Okay, so this is yet another variation of the baby story. So there's she's this woman who appears. So really the external female appearance is only a ruse. And this is actually this other kind of demon. The person who was requested to hold the baby would usually then try to throw the baby away and run, but by then the baby would have turned into a heavy stone that would not separate. The person would then be killed and eaten by the Chthonia, according to legend. Therefore, it is said that if one is asked to hug a baby, one ought to do so only after putting on gloves, and when fleeing, one ought to toss everything, including the gloves, which is interesting. So the idea is that somehow it's going to get stuck to your hands, is really where it seems like it's going to get stuck. But if you have gloves, then you can detach the gloves and get rid of them. In the legends of Oda, Shimane, a man entrusted with the baby from the Nure-onna would be assaulted by an Chthonia, and just when it seemed like he lost their trail, the Chthonia would then say, too bad, and it'd be in the same voice as the Nure-onna. In classical yokai depictions, such as the Gazu Hyaki Yago and the Hyaki Zukan, the Nure-onna would have a human face and a snake body, and the concept of feminine water turmoil is generally symbolized with the snake, as we have seen with everything from Tiamat to these other kinds of serpent-type creatures who tend to be associated with the feminine. These are often in Western myth as are the monsters of the unconscious, right? and they represent, with the collective unconscious being represented by the feminine. These are the potential monsters that lay within. Your Scylla, your Charybdis, your the different varieties, the Gorgons and things. Like, all of them have this association with the water. Okay, in certain tales, they would appear as an ubume. I was correct about that. Who would make people hug babies. Both of them would hand over a baby, symbolizing impurity and chaos, which is interesting. And both of them would lead humans to their deaths. Now, why baby would it symbolize impurity and chaos? That's something to think about here for a moment, but because there's not really a reference for this. Now let's look at the mythology. It says, Nure-onna's intentions are unknown. In some stories, she is a monstrous being who is powerful enough to crush trees with her tail and feeds on humans. She carries with her a small childlike bundle, which she uses to attract potential victims. Okay, so that's another point, too. We don't actually know whether we're dealing with a child here, or whether it's just something that has the appearance of a child. If a well-intentioned person offers to hold the baby for her, the Nure-onna will let them. If they attempt to discard the bundle, however, it is revealed it is not a child at all. Instead, the bundle becomes incredibly heavy and prevents the victim from fleeing. She then uses her long snake-like tongue to suck all the blood from her victim's body. In other stories, a Nure-onna is simply seeking solitude as she washes her hair and reacts violently to those who bother her. The Rokurokubi is a close relative to the Nure-onna. And that is a it's a type of Japanese yokai that looks almost completely human. They have a which neck stretches around and whose head detaches around freely. And so this is actually a kind of thing where the head actually of the Rokurokubi is said to be close to Nure-onna, perhaps just in terms of function or in terms of what kind of a threat that they represent. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked through all the material that's here, that is specifically about Nure-onna, and that it doesn't just make a passing reference to her. Now we want to sit back and we want to look at the elements of this. So woman with a snake body. Again, we talked about mermaids, but we also just have this idea, this notion of the terrors of the sea, but also the idea that this is a really chthonic kind of a force. Because, if we go back to the mythology of Tiamat, which, again, I realize is not Japanese, and I have had other podcasts where I go over some of these mythologies of Japanese creation and so forth in previous podcasts. But if we just take an example of a terrifying sea serpent who is also the mother of the gods and mother of all things, and when her partner is killed because the partner's threatening to kill the gods, so they go and they kill him first, Tiamat gets very, very angry and makes war on her children in a terrifying manner until Marduk stands up to her, and when he slays her, she becomes the firmament of the earth. There's many, like I said, in a lot of the hero mythologies, we have this idea of, even the idea of dragon slaying. Even though they're not always portrayed as feminine per se, the monsters that we see, this idea of the devouring monster, tends to be feminine in its inflection. We only see it in a masculine sense. Eros and Psyche myth is actually a weird symbolism of that, where what Psyche is really swallowed up in is this great mansion with invisible people that Eros puts her in. It's like in this kind of dream space where he's there, but she's unconscious of him. Like, he knows her, but she does not know him. So there's no real relationship there. She's just kind of in this space that's kind of isolated and alienated. And that, in the masculine sense, in the way that a woman can, falling in love can give you that power of removing your sensibility. I think of it being as Piscean for people who follow astrology. And Piscean thinking, it can be very dreamy, imaginative, and beautiful, but it can also be very deceptive. And so that would be looking at it from the other perspective. But if we look at it from the feminine perspective, we frequently see that. And actually in Greek mythology, we frequently see that as well. A lot of times the female figures, because they are not attacked, they don't work through direct attack or direct force, because that's not their nature. The nature of the feminine is to be more passive. And certainly this would be true also in Japanese mythology. The idea that the feminine works through and not through a direct method. She just doesn't just jump out of the water and attack you. That's not her way. Her way is to bring you in through the feminine, like deceiving through the feminine, appealing to your emotions, appealing to your empathy. And she is a creature of water, which, as we know, like I said, we're talking about this very Piscean kind of thing. The depths of water symbolically, that's the realm of Cancer in astrology, right? Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. That's all the depths, everything that we don't have on the surface, that's not part of our day-to-day life, things that needs to be uncovered, so to speak. And not everything that's uncovered is something pleasant that we want to deal with. So then it becomes interesting to think about Nure-onna in this way. I mean, just to add to that, it's also the realm of intuition. It's the realm of knowing things without knowing them. And if we think about a trickster as being something that's outside the realm of the social order, then certainly within decent, civilized, polite society, if somebody needs help, you will help them. You will support them. That's a kind of a positive aspect or attribute of the feminine. In this case, if you stop to be helpful or to admire the baby or to do something, then you are going to be in trouble. So it's almost showing you the shadow side of this. It's the way in which there's just certain contexts in which it's a violation of the social order, because if someone is in need of help and comes to help you, the proper social thing to do would be to show gratitude, right? To show gratitude to the person, sometimes even to repay the person in kind for the kindness that they show you. But you also have to remember, this is kind of keeping in what we know even about fairy lore more generally. There's a thing about fairies in the Western world where they say if they do something for you, you never are to say thank you. They don't like that. And that seems odd too, because in other words, any kind of show of gratitude is taken as an insult. And so we're talking about a realm where the rules that we would think of civility, of decency, they don't apply. And this may be just driving home the point that when we're dealing with the natural world, we're not dealing with a world that really necessarily plays along with our social expectations. Now, Confucianism is actually Chinese, okay? And it comes to mind for me right now because Confucianism is about harmony through keeping an established social order. There's a very similar concept in Hinduism, and that's of dharma, the idea that people play their appropriate social role, and that by playing this appropriate role, that this is how you have harmony. The thing is, though, when you're dealing with natural forces, and really in the what we like to call the Far East, there's definitely more of a harmonious relationship to nature. You're not talking about a concept of some kind of distant God who's watching over, judging everything about good and bad, right and wrong, and corrupt and pure. And you're not necessarily seeing that. When you're dealing with nature and natural forces, you're dealing with this something that is unpredictable, something that doesn't follow conventional morality, which is something I've talked about time and time again, is that ancient religion is not moral. And that's something that's hard for people to wrap their mind around. They think, when you think of something religious, so if you think about a religion, say, that's based on ancestor worship, like Shinto, okay, or if you have the kind of ancient belief that is more animistic, that is about trying to negotiate and live with the spirits of the trees and the rivers and the flowers and the mountains and all these things, all the trying to work with those natural forces in a way that that feels not always quite human, because one of the things you'll definitely see about these gods is that they don't look human, like or even if they're not gods. Okay, we always tend to use the term gods, but that's not always what's implied here. It's more just that they are forces. They have a certain type of power that has to be reckoned with. And it's not about, and it's funny too, when we look at those things in a Western context, there always tends to be this idea of conquest, right? How we slay the dragon, right? How we overcome and cut our way out of the demon. It's not so much about that there. It's just more about being aware of what the force is and what the dangers are of interacting with that force. What it means to close with them or to have any kind of interaction with them. And sometimes the best thing to do is simply avoidance. If you come across a situation like that, to simply not engage. Although I know there was another figure that we looked at that I think was very similar to Nure-onna, where if they tried to engage you by saying, take my baby, and you kind of said no and walked away, there could be another consequence for that. In other words, you really didn't necessarily have the option of saying no, without there being another potential means of attack. Being that she's in the water, I do wonder if this is another representation of what we think of as the terrors of the sea, the terrors of water. Because water, again, like any other element, it can people who go fishing, it can yield that. Water, of course, can clean us, it can purify us. But then when you have like today, I think Hurricane Milton is actually hitting Florida. We can also see that water can be very destructive. Certainly in Japan and places like that, they would be dealing with tsunamis and typhoons. These things do happen. So there are these natural forces that can be very, very malevolent. But what about the image of the child? That's interesting. Or the fake child. Is the child simply a ruse to prey upon somebody's innocence or somebody's trust? Because children and archetypally tend to represent that. They tend to represent something new, something born, something that's possible, but it's being held by a woman who, it's not really a child at all. It's actually more of a rock or a stone, like something that's going to weight you down. You wonder about the social implications of something like that, because if we think of these sort of dark feminine figures who are more vampiric, we often think of them in the context of the woman. Like if you think about a lot of the hungry ghosts that you have in that culture, you will see a lot of these ghosts of women who have been wronged. Okay, they've died a wrongful death, and then they sort of come back as tormentors, of those who wronged them and caused them to die before their time, or caused them to die in childbirth. And again, we have representations of this from around the world. We have the Aori, for instance, in ancient Greece, which are the restless dead who become the assistants of the Furies. There's this idea that if this feminine force is used in a way, like I said, if a woman dies when she's too young, when she hasn't had a chance to have children, then you get the motif of the woman who's the child stealer, who's going to try to steal children because she didn't have one of her own. Okay, this is, of course, very ancient. But here we have the idea of a woman who's carrying a stone that's a burden. And there's almost an implication there of illegitimacy, because they were saying impurity and chaos, but it's like, yeah, impurity in the sense of maybe a child conceived outside of wedlock, or conceived in a manner where the woman is rejected or abandoned. Now, again, none of this is part of Nure-onna's story, but we do see stories like that in the folklore, and we do see these kinds of ghosts that are very terrifying that will come back. In this kind of in the context of this violent death. We've talked about it with others. The Rusalki, at least one version of the Rusalki story, are women who have drowned or died some kind of violent death, who come back as these kinds of spirits. And so it's something that we don't necessarily see only in Japan. But this is not the spirit of a drowned woman. This is an actual. This is like an elemental type creature. It's a water type of elemental creature. And this baby, which is the stone, I mean, there could be a representation there of drowning, or of the way in which, say, one gets caught in a rip current or something and gets into the water, and then it's almost like, like somebody's tied a stone to your leg and you're being dragged down. There could be an element of that if we want to look at it as a representation of a danger of the water. But you also wonder too, if the idea of, if you are, seduced into helping someone who is, who's carrying around this child, perhaps illegitimately, that this is something that one can perhaps be dragged down into as well. Now, I don't know. A lot of it's going to depend on sort of the Japanese attitudes towards childbirth, and perhaps women who have children on their own. I know that certainly in Chinese culture, there has always been more of a favoring of male children over female children. I'm not sure if the same is true in Japan. But we see that in other cultures as well. That's not, again, those are not by far the only cultures that would have that kind of a bias. And again, we don't know anything about this baby. This baby, as far as we know, is just a rock. So, yeah, whether any of that social inflection is there or not, I don't know. It's probably more of a tenuous stretch. but it does kind of come to mind, especially since it seems like these are males that are being preyed upon. Now, there's other stories too that we will see of women. For example, La Llorona or La Llorona of Mexico, who is the one who supposedly, now she's supposed to be a ghost who drowned her children, but then she, with her cries, she actually is supposed to try to, or she appears very seductive to lure men also to their death. And similarly here, she's luring men to basically to feed on them. So there's almost kind of a succubus element here as well. The idea of the woman who feeds on the life of the man, because the blood is considered to be, your life. That's your chthonic life force. And it's like it's almost like you're being dragged down to the earth by this stone, where the child is not this representation that you see, in European mythology of the possibility for the future, right? Or the link to immortality. In this case, you're seeing this something that is apparently representative of that, but is actually just a stone that pulls you down. And I'm almost reminded of in Proverbs where they talk about the loose woman who brings one down to Sheol. And again, we're not saying that that's what Nure-onna is. There's nothing that appears to be sexual about these encounters at all. But without the sexual piece, she still seems to retain this interesting element of the seductiveness of the feminine. In this case, though, it's not about a seductive woman who tries to get you into her bed. In this case, it's a seductive woman who tries to prey upon your sense of wanting to help the helpless, right? Wanting to be the hero in a way, wanting to be the one who assists the mother in need. And this is a case where doing that actually can lead to this kind of really terrible result. So it's really an interesting concept to think about. The fact that one can have that extreme strength, but prefers to use guile and prefers to use deception to trap her victims. And it's a really it's an interesting kind of deception, and you have to wonder in folklore if people are supposed to respond to these in any way as cautionary tales, then you have to say, well, what's being cautioned here? Like if you see a helpless woman, don't help her. I mean, if you look at it in that sense. But of course, then you have to remember that a lot of what we think of as folklore and myth, and sometimes there's this overlap here between the two, because again, we're not necessarily dealing with gods per se. In Japanese myth, there certainly are gods that belong to the celestial realm, but these seem to be spirits that are just, again, this is the life of the earth. This is the consciousness of the earth in its different forms. And this is more of the what's in shadow. This is more of the negative side of something, and really a demonstration of how these forces do not have a morality to them. It's not a thing, and you can actually probably see it in nature too. There are certain species that disguise themselves as something that'll be appealing, or that will cause some other creature that they want to prey upon to be attracted towards them so that they can then attack. Deception is something that does happen in nature. Although this idea of, the woman in distress, or the woman with the baby who is in distress, definitely it's almost like this dark side of the feminine that's going to prey on you if you act in a way that we consider to be part of, empathy or correct social etiquette, that there's these forces that can take you in. So it's definitely something to think about here. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on it as well. But this serpent woman, and also please also remember that the serpent aspect of her in the I'm going to call it the Far East, the serpents don't necessarily have a negative connotation, just like dragons don't have a negative connotation. Dragons tend to be symbols of luck. They tend to be symbols of the earth. They're not considered to be evil creatures. And serpents and things like that are not necessarily seen to be evil. So it does make me wonder if this is representing this specific danger of the water, this specific danger. If you want to talk about it in terms of Jungian consciousness, if we think about the collective as being that space, those dark waters where the monsters lurk, then when we explore that realm, which really to be a complete human, we need to interact with that realm. We do interact with that realm. We interact with it through dreams. We interact with it when we follow our instincts, follow our gut, follow our intuition. We're taking things out of that collective symbol system, and they are becoming part of, they become part of our consciousness. They become something that we can look at and negotiate in whatever way that we need to negotiate, whether it's something we need to incorporate into ourselves, whether it's something that we need to let go of. It's a rather interesting and intricate imagery here. But here we definitely see the serpent as having kind of a deceptive kind of a form, and taking on this deceptive role. So it does also make me wonder. It says how long ago the concept of the Nure-onna came into being. Now, this one story that's mentioned is from 1819, but surely these are stories that are much older than that. It may just be a matter of when. It's like any culture. When does it appear in the literature? And the literature is just what we have as written evidence. That it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something that hasn't been around for a very long time. And if the origins would be known, that would be very, very interesting to know, like, if it came out of a certain period of time, and what were the cultural influences at that time. Because there seems to be the serpent as representing something that you can't trust, which is not typically a theme in the Far East. Again, serpents are not considered to be negative. In most cultures, they're not considered to be negative. But also the fact that you have this woman, this wet woman who is like this, who is this kind of vampiric kind of creature. What she represents, or is this, when we think of the dark feminine as representing this kind of sovereignty and independence, we have this seems to be a force. It's kind of this devouring mother force. It's this force that's there to rather than create life, rather than to destroy it, but uses a ruse of creation or something newly created to bring about destruction. And there's almost the implication that created thing that she's holding. I mean, if we were to say it was an actual baby of some type, which doesn't seem to be implied here exactly. But even if we were to say it, the idea is that it turns into a stone or it turns into some other kind of creature. And if that's the case, then it's almost the idea of a creation that is that weighs us down, like a creation that doesn't lead to expansion, but leads to contraction in some way. So, and we normally see that in mythologies of Greece and Rome and places like that, as things that are connected to taboos, like incest or cannibalism, of course. But of course, if the Nure-onna is not human, to say that she's cannibalizing people is not really quite right, because it's not like one human eating another human, right? She's not a human being. So she is, but she eats human flesh, and or drinks human blood. And so she almost seems to be almost a force of nature that needs to be appeased in some way, or that needs to be appeased through blood. We have talked about that with ancient earth mothers and things that have this, that when you're talking about certain Chtonic beings, that blood is what they require in some fashion, that there is, or in the case of men, it can also be castration. There's this idea that this is something, This is that aspect of the mother that is terrifying. So probably if I was going to conclude anything about Nure-onna, I would have to say that she is this kind of archetype of the terrifying or devouring mother, in a way. Even though we're not really sure that she's a mother, even though there seems to be no sexual aspect to her, like she's carrying this baby around, and again, like the Obume, which is an actual woman carrying a baby around, like a ghost of a woman. and again, with a very similar result. They hold the baby and then they suddenly become weighted down. Though in one version of the Ubume story, a man recites a Buddhist prayer, and then the Ubume comes back and thanks him for releasing her baby into the world. So somehow by doing that, that almost implies the idea that these may represent attachments of some sort, attachments that will weigh you down. And for the person perhaps who wants to be like the equivalent of a Hindu sannyasi that goes out to the woods and meditates and doesn't engage with family life and so forth, this could almost be representing the dangers of getting involved with that, or getting involved with women maybe who are of a questionable reputation or that are impure. Again, if you're trying to interpret it in a social sense, because a lot of times, while myth is meant to express a truth about something that is not that can't really be talked about literally. And I find that there's a lot in mythology and in folklore, like in this case, that is not explained through it's showing a quality of human behavior, or it's showing a quality of existence, and it's expressing it through a type of a story or type of a tale, without it necessarily having a lot of logical sense to it, or even necessarily any kind of social recommendation to it. That's why I think a lot of times we have trouble reading stories like this if we try to read them as, like we try to read things now in terms of the idea of ethics and judgment. Oh, this is a tale to warn, like the Jenny Greenteeths and so forth in England, and the Peg Powlers, where, oh, this is a warning not to get too close to the water because you might drown. Right? And this could be a very similar kind of tale, but is it just meant to be a cautionary tale? Or is this just saying something about the way in which feminine forces don't operate above board? They operate through, possibly through deception and through guile. And again, we see this in a lot of world mythologies and world folk tales. And what is it telling us about this thing that we're encountering? I think if anything, when we talk about the dark feminine, a lot of people think about embracing their dark feminine as saying being an empowered woman or being an independent woman. But I think this is also saying that there's an aspect to all of this, that the aspect of the feminine is both creative and destructive, okay, in this particular way of looking at things. And it's almost the idea that it's not simply, oh, creation good, destruction bad. It's like there's some nuance here as to, like, sometimes we may create things that lead to our destruction. For example, what is the nature of the feminine is deep. It's not necessarily going to follow the rules. It was like in our class, the class that Joanna did on Baba Yaga. Just because you follow all the rules and do all the right things doesn't mean you're going to get the result. I mean, you could still not only fail anyway, but you could still be killed anyway. It doesn't. You're almost getting into Lovecraftian territory, where it's kind of like you're in this universe and the forces of it don't necessarily care about you. They're just there. And it really emphasizes that this is a force that's just there, and it's just there to feed itself. It's not that she has a purpose. There may not even... I don't... we're looking around for a potential moral inflection here, but I don't think there necessarily needs to be one. I think that's a habit that we have in our culture, that we start looking for this morality probably where there is none. And it's a reminder that when you're dealing with nature and natural forces, and like I said, now I'm thinking about the hurricane, notwithstanding idiots who seem to think that, certain political parties can control the weather, which is just like, I don't know if that's a new low or what, but in any case, yeah, there's just this idea, whether certainly something like that, and I think I'm likening it right now to the fact that there's this massive Cat 5 hurricane hurtling towards Florida. Though I heard that they might have downgraded to a Cat 3 by the time it got there. Not that that's any less devastating, but it's maybe slightly less devastating, but still devastating. It's not something. You could be a good person and do all the right things, and that's not going to stop a hurricane coming through. It's that kind of a thing. Forces of nature are what they are. And I think in a lot of ways we're trying to figure out how to negotiate them. And sometimes literally, like in the case of a hurricane, the only thing you can do is run away, It's you can the only thing you can do is just, get out of the way, yield. This may be why certain varieties of Japanese karate are about avoidance. The way in which one negotiates the feminine is by just simply, staying out of its path, not allowing yourself to be drawn in places where you could potentially be dragged down or overcome. So I don't know. This could just be a representation of a certain kind of force that if you allow yourself to be in the path of it or allow yourself to be deceived by it, where you could be attacked. And probably the only answer, if somebody was going to hear this kind of a story and be afraid, would be, well, there's certain situations that you want to be careful of or steer away from or avoid. So, interesting. A lot of things to think about here. And probably, I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, okay? Perhaps there are people who are, maybe who listen to this, who know more about it, who might be able to talk a little bit more about where she fits into that social inflection, if there is a social inflection there or not. I don't, from what I do know, I don't necessarily get the impression that that's what it is. But I do feel like it connects in with a worldview that is more where what we think of as deities, or forces that we, have an interaction with, that are not like us. Supernatural forces, what some people call them, whether they're really supernatural or not is another argument. I don't know that they always are. But how do we interact with them? And how do you deal with the numinous? How do you deal with what's with the other that's present with you all the time? We have become so intellectualized, our intellectual minds into being a barrier between us and those forces. I think I was saying it on my live stream this morning. I said I think intellect is as much of a defense as it is a way of negotiating the world. It's a defense tool, is what it is. Because with our minds, we try to sort things out. We try to create order out of chaos, right? But sometimes with the forces of chaos, you just don't have that. There's no way that the mind can approach it. The only thing the mind can do is maybe yield to it or avoid it. So, by stepping out of the way of it. So anyway, interesting topic for today. And speaking of storms and things, I am going to probably be covering the storm hags in the next podcast. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for listening. If you did enjoy this video, please, if you're watching on YouTube, do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. That would be really helpful. If you're listening to this in podcast form, thank you so much for listening. If you're not a member of my Patreon and would like to join, I do extra podcasts. People who are join at a certain level can get free classes at the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth. Right now, that's what I've been offering as course benefit. And of course, I always send out some new swag and things to people who have just joined. So if you want to join, patreon.com/Chthonia. You can follow me on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word. I'm on Instagram primarily. X, I'm barely there and may get off at some point. And Facebook, it's Chthonia Podcast, 2 words. And the channel's just called Chthonia on YouTube, but you can find it at Chthonia Podcast, 1 word. Thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.